All right. Well, hey everyone. Welcome to another episode. Wow, it's a tough word to say of the Xibition podcast. Of course, right now you're seeing Mark and Ron on the screen, but we have a special guest today that I've been excited about doing this interview for a long time because, as you're going to find out in this podcast, honestly, so much of what is happening and what we do at the Xibition comes from the Canadian Supreme. And so today's guest is our friend Jeff Robson, son of Dave and Val Robson, of course, who created the Canadian Supreme so many years ago. We're going to get into all those details today. But of course, Ron, the Canadian Supreme is so special to you. Do you have anything that you just want to talk about before we bring Jeff on? Because he's here ready to go with us.
It was just a prideful thing for Canada. It really was a creation, as you say, of Dave and Val Robson. And it was a prideful thing for Canada because it was well known throughout North America as a singularly tremendous platform for the equine competition in Western things. But Jeff will shed more light on that. So I look forward to this too.
Yeah, let's get him on here.
All right. Well, there he is.
I'm here.
Jeff, welcome to the Xibition podcast, buddy. How you doing?
Oh, I'm great. How are you guys?
Good. Thanks for coming, man.
I'm going to take a Ron Anderson here to answer that. I'm going to say just right.
That would be
just right.
Yeah, just right.
So Jeff, you're still in Calgary, and for our new listeners who didn't get to go to the Canadian Supreme, that's where you and I met, was there at the Canadian Supreme. What I remember, of course, is all those years of you being up in the announcer booth, assisting Ron in all the different roles that you were playing there. I mean, the Canadian Supreme was absolutely a family show. And so you'd see your brother there and your mom and dad and that. And but that's what I remember. I mean, I can't remember what year that HD2 got involved at the Canadian Supreme. I remember how it all happened. I want to talk about that a little bit today. But that's how you and I met. You and I have become friends. We play our morning hockey together, which is great because, everybody knows this is a hockey podcast. So thank you for joining us today and sharing some of the memories of what was an incredible event here in Western Canada for so many years that your family created for us.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And I think the Xibition really defines your hockey prowess.
Okay, dig deeper. Come on.
Already we've got a shot across the bows here.
And most of the fans of the show don't know, but Dave is one of the few people in the whole world that is self-proclaimed his own nicknames as it relates to hockey. So he has such a plethora of them. We can't keep up with them, but some of his favorites are D-Zone, which he never spends any time in, and but he's most known in our circle is Hollywood for his big flashy goals. So,
oh man, it's funny how people come to know you in certain circles. Like for all of my life, when I first started playing hockey, my nickname was Bernie for just over a year. Because my last name is Bernard, and everybody spells it wrong. But on my jersey, it's spelled correctly. But, a year and a half in, I had a coach. He says, "Why are we calling you Bernie? Your last name's not Bernard. We should call you Benny." And so then I became Benny. Quick story, because this is how it goes. Back when I came to Calgary, I was playing hockey at the University of Calgary. A girl who worked with the team trainer got me a job at a restaurant. She knew me as Benny. Everyone at the restaurant thought my name was Benny. There was a Dave that worked at the restaurant. And one day my girlfriend calls me at work and says, "Is Dave there?" And she says, "No, Dave isn't working today." And when I got home, I had a lot of explaining to do. I wasn't at work. I was at work. She didn't ask for Benny. So yes, Hollywood in the morning, pretty funny name. I don't know. I try to live up to it and put on a show. So here's a show.
And here we are.
And here we are. Well, no, but see, but you tried to give me a new nickname. You tried to give me the nickname The Judge. We should call you The Judge, you said. Luckily, it didn't stick. But why were you thinking that?
Well, because you always want to judge in on somebody's, whether it's hockey related, news related, horse related. You're always giving your opinion. So I thought, we might as well, we're always so judgy. So I thought The Judge seemed fitting.
I'm looking at the panel here, and I can see another guy who maybe would fit that bill a little better. He's laughing right now.
Okay, so I'm not judgy. I'm opinionated. I'm opinionated. Yeah, I'm opinionated. And the thing is, it takes a very little catalyst to start it up. So that's a good thing about that.
I rebranded because when Jeff decided that I was judgy, I mean, the first thing I noticed, because I'm a noticer, I said, well, geez, that seems judgy. And so I thought, well, we can both be the judge. That would have made sense. But I realized, Ron, I'm just observational. If I don't have an opinion about something, I just notice it. I point it out. It's factual. That's where I fall in here,
Yeah. Well, I have opinions on things I don't know anything about, and that's handy. That's handy. But anyway,
because everybody cares about that.
After 15 minutes of being next to me, I mean, there you are. Yeah. You got it.
Hey, I'm pointing left, right, and center. I mean, on camera, I know. See, it's going that way. Yeah. Ron, tell us what you remember about Jeff going back, because I bet you knew him as a young lad.
Oh, I did too. When we started to talk about the podcast, of course, and Canadian Supreme, it's a big deal for me because it was such a big deal, and I was I had the pride of all Canadians and the pride of all horsemen in the fact that it was what it was, and to celebrate as it morphed and grew, it had 3 elements in it. But when it started out, it was a cow horse deal. It started out as a snaffle bit cow horse, and then added all the other periphery classes, the Hackamore division and the bridle division. And Dave was instrumental in the development of all of that. And he was one who took the Canadian Rein Cow Horse Association to the next level. And Jeff, we just established in our little pre-conversation, you were pretty young when the very first show started, but you were a bit of a cow horse guy too as a youth. And I'm thinking that my early recollection is you came and rode with me a little. You recall that? Because
I do.
You and I have chatted about that time and time again. It was during a specific era of my life, and
yeah, I mean, because it's a podcast, I could probably share things that I wouldn't normally share if I was actually on TV or something. But yeah, my dad used to drive me over to Sylvan Crest Stables for riding lessons in the wintertime. And on the way to drive over, my dad used to say things like, well, I wonder if Ron's going to show up tonight. He said, he's a little bit like the wind. He says, you never know if he's going to show up or not. So that's how I got to know, that was kind of my early recollection of Ron. But, Ron always showed up and eventually, and yeah, it was always good.
Oh, man.
That's
great.
I can't deny any of that.
The 70s and 80s were a wonderful time.
They certainly were.
I didn't know this connection, but knowing you like I know you now, Jeff, and knowing that Ron was such an influence in your early years, it all makes sense.
Again,
probably more sense than it should.
Yeah,
exactly. If there's some commonality there, holy cow, how scary.
So Ron,
Yes.
I'm curious, how was Jeff doesn't do show cow horse anymore? Is there a reason? Was it lack of his talent? Did he run out of talent there, or what was the situation? What happened?
Flawed fundamentals? Are you thinking maybe flawed fundamentals? Jeff, how long did you cow horse? You cow horse through your teens, though. Is that fair to say?
I think I would say kind of vaguely remember through like kind of in that 12, 13, 14 years old type thing.
Yes.
Then, we showed all through high school rodeo, still showed some cutters and while I was roping and doing some other things. So yeah, it was always a part of our life for sure. And yeah, always enjoyed watching my dad, and yeah.
Oh, he was, you get thinking about that. I mean, he was not only was he really big on promoting the sport, equine Western performance sports, but he was very much a competitor too, was he not? That's I mean, I remember that part of it.
Yeah, it's I think a true test of whether how good somebody was as a horseman. And lots of people obviously recognize my dad as was an entrepreneur and a visionary, but man, when you rode the horses that he rode, you got on after he'd been on, you're like, wow, these horses are broke, they're supple, they're amazing. Like
Yeah.
I always remember that, getting on and go, geez, I need to work on this. And my hands aren't nearly as good as his. And yeah, like he demanded a lot from his horses, but I think his he always had great horses and always had a great feel to them.
Well, I think it's so admirable, and probably very key to why he was able to put together such great competitions and always be at the forefront of developing new ideas for the Canadian Supreme, was because he was a horseman and he was very conscious of the horse scene across North America. And he was such a good listener. He really was a good listener.
Yeah, no, he was, even as we got into business together later on, he was, I always, he always said, if you just listen long enough, that person will solve their own problem. And I think that that always seemed to ring true. Like, I remember calling him about some business stuff sometime, we'd be struggling with something, and by the time that conversation was over, I had my own answer. He goes, "Yep, good, great conversation."
Wow. You know what?
Yeah.
That seems what I came to know your dad and your family towards the end of the Canadian Supreme. But to me, it seems like one of the greatest strengths of your dad was empowering people. Like, when I think of a coach or a teacher, it seems like that's what your dad, Dave, what represented. Is that right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, he, like lots of people talk about all the buzzwords that you read about in books, and but very few people can actually act on those things. And he was, he was just such a guy, a character, and when he said it, he meant it, and when he said it, he did it. And yeah, like those are principles that are, just hard to come by, and they're getting harder and harder to come by.
Yeah.
I sure agree with
Now,
that.
hey,
Go ahead, Dave.
Ron, just as we work through the conversation, we chatted, I think it was last week, about that. Val was a big part of that connection too, and that partnership and that. And so can you speak to me a little bit more? I knew your mom. I got to meet her. She seemed like just so much fun, and always be at the show office at the Canadian Supreme, and she'd be there with a big smile on. But I need to know more about how Val connects into all of that as well.
Yeah, well, I think you touched on it earlier. It really was a family event. I don't know that she got enough accolades for all the work that she put in behind the scenes. My grandfather, her dad, he would come up and put the back fences up, and when I was a kid, I remember him, working for 4 or 5 days up there before, and hanging signs and the stallion signs, and my brother as we got older, he would be up there a week in advance. I don't think people understood how much work was actually gone into some of those things. Obviously, Betty from my dad's office, Betty Gardner, or Betty Kunka now, she's she was a huge part of that. So like it was truly a family event. As it got later in the years, I would come up more towards when show started, and but yeah, it definitely was a family event, and there's a lot of elbow grease from the Robson family, put into that show, and without those things, and then Patrick, Betty's husband, later on, he came and he would be, baling shavings into the stalls for people, so they didn't have to put the show, so they came up with machines that did that, and yeah, like lots and lots of really cool fond memories of all that. But I think that was the part that everybody prided themselves on, was putting on that show, and all the work that went into it.
Well, I think that's
The
the
word.
key that
Yeah.
you just said there is the pride was so obvious from the whole family. And now as you went through the staffing of it, Jeff, I so remember it was the first day coming to the Supreme when you moved in as a competitor. The first day was like, I can still remember all the highlights of coming first day. You'd see your grandfather, you'd see your mom, and your mom was like, she was a cheerleader. That's
Yeah.
what she was. She was a cheerleader, and she had this was almost pre-Betty, but she had she handed out everybody's welcome package. She had your all your confirmations, and so she knew everyone. Your grandpa was there. I remember all the details that he did, but everybody was they were so proud of what they were doing, but they didn't tell you that. But the enthusiasm told you that.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
I think that's what that current deal that traveled through from the barns right through to the show pen was always there.
I'm curious what was like, I want to go way back. Like, what was the evolution of, and I want to comment on the fact that you can just say the Supreme because it's the Canadian Supreme. But when you have a show as I guess famous and as important, then it just becomes the Supreme and everyone knows what you're talking about. But what was that evolution? And when was that? I want to use the word innovation. When was that always a part of what was happening with the Canadian Supreme? Because I've got a list of things that were happening there that I still, as far as I recall, or my experience, and we've gone as HD2 across Western Canada to see all the different shows that are happening. There were things that happened at the Canadian Supreme that still don't happen at other Western Performance horse events. So, Ron, can you go back, or Jeff, do you remember, like, what was that? When did it become what I learned as the Supreme, or was that right out of the gates?
Well, I don't think it was out of the gates, and Ron probably knows better than I do from the early days. But I think what my dad was always fond of was, even from the days it was in Clarisholm early on. I think my dad was always a big believer that he wanted to go and see shows. So he would go to shows across North America and enter shows and was very, very curious that way. Always very curious. He was curious about technology, always curious about horses, curious about shows. But he'd come home from some event and he'd say, at this show they were doing this and that. We gotta figure out a way to do that. And he was always just so curious about how to make his show better. And I would call it his show because it was his show. Like, it was truly his show. He had lots of unbelievable volunteers over the years that sat on those committees and the boards, but it was his show. There's no question it was his show. And it took a lot, but he was always never satisfied. He would come home and go, I didn't like this. I didn't like this. Next year we need to change that. So he always liked things that were, he wanted to be transparent. He wanted to have, there wasn't a lot of money. I think there was a lot of assumptions that he was raking in a lot of money over the years in that show. And I can tell you from my perspective, that was definitely not the case. And so, he really did it because he believed in it. And so every one of those, the changes, evolutions, they were all because he just wanted it to be better, and it didn't really matter what it cost. And so I think there was always a misconception in the world that, man, we're making a killing here, but that is clearly not the case.
Yeah. Well, I think for those of us that got to see the technology that he brought to the show that early, we know he moved part of his office into that office at Red Deer, and at some point we were kind of amazed at how our computer programs were running so much better and so much faster. And I think it was in the subtle tones of one Jeff Robson sitting beside me. He said, "Well, they should be." He says, they're tapped right into the Veritas ones. They're on the Veritas server.
Yeah.
I mean, here we are on a global seismic company's server running this horse show. I mean, that's kind of like, that was the concept. I don't understand all the technology, but that's what he brought to it. You asked about the timelines, Dave, and it started out from a regular cow horse show that in 1976 that you would recognize, Snaffle Bay at Maturity. First time out for the 3-year-olds, there'd be a hackamore class with 4s and 5s, and there'd be a bridle contest. And that would be the core of the show. And as it moved along, Dave added a cutting horse event, cutting horse limited aged events into it, factored it in. He conceived of a stallion subscription program. And I believe that it was kind of somewhat prompted by the National Cutting Horse Association Super Stakes program. And that was in the early days. Does that sound right, Jeff?
Yeah, that's 100% right.
Yeah. And he started it wasn't just a Canadian stallion subscription. It was whoever wanted to subscribe the stallions. And it was that lit the tail on fire. That just created the Canadian Supreme. So he featured horses that were sired by the nominated stallions. He had open to the world classes and the protected classes at the Supreme. Protected meaning that they were the nominated offspring of nominated horses. And I think at one point there was over 100 stallions nominated to the Supreme. And that became a purchase criteria. So on your list of when you were horse shopping, if a horse was not nominated to the Canadian Supreme program, it dropped on your priority list significantly. It would almost come off some people's list because the payouts were good. The opportunity to be involved in such a tremendously proven program was all there. So, and the reining was a late addition, but Dave included that because he felt that was another high level endeavor for the Western Performance Horse, and it deserved to be part of the Canadian Supreme. And it was the inclusion of all those three that made the Canadian Supreme absolutely iconic across North America. That's why you would have judge after judge tell you every year for 40 some years, we've never gone to a facility or to a show, an event that has and features all three of the major disciplines. And also the design of the stallion subscription was used as a template for a significant number of other events, both here in Canada and in the US. So the design was pretty well thought out and modified when needed. Anyway, that's my recollection.
Yeah. It makes me excited to know that the roots go back to Claire's home, because everyone who's a part of the exhibition knows that Claire's home is it was the beating heart of the beginning of what is now becoming the X, and to think that that was the foundation that started the Canadian Supreme. I didn't know that, and that's pretty darn awesome to me. We talk about innovation. I mean, something that we loved and we joked and we talked about all the time, of course, was the Skeeter board, and so what year did that come in? Because it lived past its technological advance, but the concept of it is what made it so valuable to the show.
Yeah, I'm not sure when it came, but I know that was a big deal to my dad. Like, there was a period of time too where the Skeeter board, as you call it, was so important because you weren't allowed to, and Ron would probably know this better. We weren't allowed to announce scores. So the only way to get scores into people's hands was to have a scoreboard behind the judges. Yeah. Yep. And so here we are. Like, that's how that started. I mean, that's where it all came in. And, of course, then that went by the wayside later on. But yeah, it was kind of interesting, right? Like, I mean, that was why.
It was one of the, excuse me, it was one of the first and only show that I was aware of that used a display board, and the only other places that were using them were rodeos.
Yeah.
And you're right about the scores, Jeff. It was all hinged. It was reflective of and it's still today, the NCHA futurity. They don't announce the scores. They display the scores. And it's to maintain the impartiality of the judges. They just mark their cards, score goes up, and the go rounds and the finals are unaffected by how that panel of judges is marking. And it has its merits, and most certainly the Dave's innovation with the Canadian Supreme was to move that show up a step all the time. He was never content with where it was. He always wanted to make it. He always wanted to improve it. So we saw so much of that.
And a part of the conversation that I hear, because obviously the Yellowstone effect we bring up all the time on the podcast, but the conversation lens from, is this a horse show or is this an event? And the event being more of, is this entertainment? And to me, the first time I ever saw a rider work a cow down the fence was at cinch night. And I'm curious about the evolution of cinch night, because to me, that's what transformed the Canadian Supreme as an experience to it being an event. At the same time, it was a horse show. So it accomplished both. It was so entertaining. It was so exciting. What was the evolution of cinch night?
I think the big thing was certainly talk around our house was always around highlighting of certain events. The bridle class. There's some epic bridle runs on those cinch nights, and how to make that kind of a bit of more of a show. So it's more of a more entertainment value. People want to come and shop at the booths, and they want to, and what night are you going to guarantee that people are going to come and fill the stands? Well, it was always cinch night. And so you had some of your best cutters, you had some of the, you had the bridle horse stuff, you had like some of the non-bridle, some of the bridleless stuff. And then, we've even done some fun things over the years. We like team branding and get everybody outside of their comfort zone and do some other fun things. Yeah. In the early days in Claresholm, they even did some like team penning, and yeah, they did a bit of everything, right? So it was fun to see everybody just kind of let their hair down, and no pun intended for Ron, and just, have some fun with it. And so, we get some drinks, have some entertainment, try and build a bit of a show around it. And then, highlight some of the, tried to touch on all the disciplines. That became harder and harder with ground and stuff like that. But, there was a period of time where we tried to touch all three disciplines in that cinch night. I think, Ron, you would remember all those things.
Yes. Yeah, they did, and made a great effort. But the entertainment value, that was key, wasn't it? I so agree with you, Jeff. Tried to create a Saturday night of entertainment, and unbelievably recognized a Saturday night at the Supreme, cinch night, as it were. I can remember being in that building in Red Deer, and for fence run after fence run, and it was deafening in there, absolutely deafening.
Yeah.
Those aluminum stands, people would get to stomping their feet on the aluminum stands, and it was unbelievable. I've not experienced a night like cinch night in my career. Nothing like that.
Yeah.
Not the noise and the enthusiasm, because the people that came were so knowledgeable and so enthusiastic. It was crazy.
Yeah. Well, people would there was a period of time there where like security had to lock the doors before people would come in. And people were so anxious to get in. And, it was almost like mob central, because people wanted a seat, and you wanted to get a seat before everybody came in. So, there was they went to lengths to try and, I remember we even hired some security at one time so we could try and manage who's breaking down the door and coming in and sitting down. Yeah, it was really interesting.
Oh man, that's so much fun. I mean, something else that you guys were leaders in from everything I've seen is, of course, how you maybe attracted the sponsors or connected with sponsors. I mean, the fact that it was branded as Cinch Night, that's an example of that level of innovation. But how important and how did you guys go about making this added value to those sponsors who supported your show? Because the reality is like we can't do these events. I mean, you already talked about how the budgets, they don't make sense when you're trying to put on a horse event like the Canadian Supreme or like the Xibition, because I smiled at it. People went back when you start talking about that. Yeah, making money is not not why you get into this. But anyways, what was your approach to sponsors and partners, if you will, because we like to use that language too, not just sponsors, partners.
Yeah, I think some of the early days, I would say pre Andy Chicoria, Dave put his money where his mouth was. So, it was easy for him. He went around to like people that had no interest in the horse business. He goes, I run this little show and you should put some money into this. So we had like Bennett Jones was a law firm that we used for a long time. They put money into it. We had, people had zero interest in horse stuff and they put money into it. And, later on, obviously there was, Andy did a great job with our sponsors in the later years. But he looked after them, he hosted them, made sure their signage was right. Andy did such a great job for us on the sponsorship side. But yeah, I think his early days was, I support you, you should support my thing. And he said, yeah, I just twisted his arm and made him do it. So, and when Dave asked for something, most people would give it to him. So, yeah, made sense.
Yeah, I'm hearing that you have a clear advantage there, but it's not it's an earned advantage, right?
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, obviously they could say no, but yeah, I think he said, hey, this means a lot, and and then you start developing some relationships with some of the more local people, and like places like Wees Western Wear, and came back year after year after year, not only from a booth perspective, but they're local in town, and Jones Boys, and yeah, there was some great people that would benefit from it as well, and so yeah, it was good. I think he did a good job of that.
One of the things that I saw that happened all the time or regularly, back to Cinch Night, of course, there was the VIP seating.
Yeah.
And right out center on the Queen Mary, as we called it, the center stage. When they moved to Queen Mary out there, the judges stand and the video stand and set, it had that VIP seating. Well, Saturday night, Cinch Night, there was a collection of 12 to 15 people that would make their way out, and they would be introduced like red carpet kind of concept. As they made their way out, we would introduce them as they went out, took their seats in the VIP seating. And in the awards, we always tried, it was protocol. It was in the Canadian Supreme announcer's book that Betty gave me. I mean, this was a foolproof, bulletproof deal. You followed this. And in there was the protocol of introductions of the title sponsor. So Wees Western Wear was a great one. For year after year, I believe they were sponsor of the bridal work, so that the fence work. And you introduced the individual associated with Wees Western Wear. You would comment, you'd had statistical data on how long Wees Western Wear had been associated, and each of the corporate sponsors was acknowledged during the class, and they were involved in the presentation. So they shook the person's hand that received the award. All of those things were definitive, and the title of the class was one thing I remember. The sponsors were given a class, and it was introduced as such and such of that class. Sponsor had the name of the class. So, and those were things that Dave was, on top of. And Jeff, I think I'm thinking back as we go through this. Remember a couple of times you and I were sitting up there, possibly, but it's possible that we were having a little bit too much fun and not paying attention to jobs. And we would get a phone call from Dave with some new instructions.
Yeah. It sounded like, hey, you two jackasses, start paying attention.
It's not that you weren't
Very
paying
similar.
attention, just not to
we
the
were
right
always
thing.
paying attention to something.
We were, but I mean, that was his, I mean, that was, you mentioned it earlier, Jeff, you commented on Dave's eye for details and how he wanted it to unfold and how he wanted it to look. That was the thing. I mean, he was always there, and we would jokingly say, "Whoop, better watch out. He's watching." And he would watch the webcast. He would watch all the things that went on, or he'd be there in person, and he would just ghost around. He knew everything that was going on there, and how it could be kept the same, made better, streamlined, whatever. Yeah, it was a pretty amazing job that he had.
Jeff, I don't know if you appreciate the impact that you and your family had on the industry, but Ron and Mark and Eric and I were at the shows all the time. One quote that is probably the number one biggest quote that we hear at all the shows, Raining Cutting Cow Horse, is "I miss the Canadian Supreme." Right? I'm not wrong on that.
Oh, yeah.
Like we hear it over and over again. And so, I know I've talked to you enough, Jeff, and people don't understand all of the hard work and the struggles and everything. I mean, we come to the show and you see the finished product, but like one of the things I've written down is this is a year-long project. And I would say that was innovative in itself, where, like, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but like you had staff who that was their 365-day-a-year job, was to build what was the Supreme. And then the Supreme is the result of that. So I just wanted to share that with you because you don't get to hear that. You're not at the shows with us, but over and over and over again, I miss the Canadian Supreme. It was that valuable, it was that important. And it was, and so we celebrate that. We celebrate that all the time, whether it's here on the podcast or how we go about trying to build a show that can even start to come close to what was that. But I didn't want to forget that. You mentioned as far as like the trade show. And so that connects to my comment is that's something that everyone says, we missed that. We missed that there was a trade show in Red Deer. People love that. Like when did that start? And when did it, I think we saw it at its peak, but that was such an important part of the experience.
Yeah, I think I vaguely remember in Clarisome there being the odd booth set up. When we first moved to Red Deer, Ron was one of our first. Ron used to have a monogram company, for lots of people that don't know. Some people would definitely remember. But him and Marilyn would do monograms. I think Marilyn and
it was a partner. I had a partner, but anyway.
Okay, yeah, that's probably fair. And then so there was probably 6 or 7 booths set up in the Stockmans, and so that kind of grew, and then it was like, okay, well, we've gotten so much activity now that we needed to move it over to the pavilion to beside it where most people would know where it was, and then pretty soon then it was like went from 2 or 3 rows to 4 or 5 rows to 6 rows to trailers to like it just kept morphing into this thing, right? And and so lots of our sponsors, that's how we tied a lot of our sponsors to the show, was through I could think of like Penners and Allendale and like lots of those people. That's how we tied them to the show, and how we made that part of the sponsorship package was them bringing their booths to life. So we had people that never missed ever. Like they wouldn't, I wouldn't even call them cow horse people or cutting people, but they would never not be at that show in the trade show. So, and then we tried to do some things over the years. We tried to have some live music. We did, we had tried to have some of those sitting areas where you could have some drinks, and it was a constant battle with, not a shot at Westerner Park, by the way, but a constant battle of, how long can we have the liquor license? When can we have it? Like we battled with that every year. But it was always worth the battle because people would come and they get to sit down, have a drink, relax, do some shopping, visit, have some nights where Huckleberries would come in and bring some pie, and we'd have a little event, and on a Thursday night, I think it was, and yeah, just all those little things, like it just became what you did on Thursday night at the Supreme. And so, yeah, I think that's all really, really good stuff. And I think Dave's vision of tying that all together with, the sponsor and the booths and the show and the classes, like Ron talked about, all that made it kind of value add.
Well, I certainly agree, and those are great memories. And it was Thursday night, Huckleberries, and the feast. But the trade fair morphed into. I remember when the first year we were there with the monogramming outfit, and we were stuck on the concourse of the Stockmans, and initially it seemed like, oh, we're good here. This will work fine. Well, Saturday night, my golly, it was jammed. I mean, I felt like we were in a closet, and just masses of people. But that's really one of the great memories that people have of the Canadian Supreme. A lot of meetings took place between people only once a year, and that's where it was at the Canadian Supreme.
Wow. Well, something else that people miss about the Canadian Supreme, and I feel like I'm completely lacking in knowledge and understanding of its importance. And there was a horse sale that was a part of the Supreme as well. And that's, again, people tell me like, hey, you got to have a horse sale because the Canadian Supreme had a horse sale. Like, where did that integrate? How was that important to the show?
Yeah, well, I think it's the vision of that was to start off with having Supreme nominated horses and an outlet for those horses. But I think in later years, it opened up, Ron, you would probably know this better, obviously, but I think it opened up to just any horses. But I think that's true.
Yes, it did, but there were different variations of what could happen. There was special sections for Canadian Supreme nominated horses, but it really was an add-on added value. Sales have or can have, they're entertainment. They are entertainment, and it was a time in the evolution of the horse industry where a well-run sale was an asset. And again, it was like one of the events it was Friday night at the Supreme was sale night. And it again, it was used, not probably, it was very much a barometer of the health of the horse industry, and it set some prices. It set the tone of what the price was because it was a recognized sale. It was well run, and it was part of the biggest deal on the calendar in the horse world.
And it seems to me like the connection then that we've talked about recently on the podcast between the horse sale and then we touched on the breeding program. But like right now, Ron, you've made the comment, like the Canadian dollar being so weak that in order for there to be that still great opportunity for those Western performance horse, whether it's the breeders or just the competitors themselves, that special experience here in Canada was essential. I'm hoping that, with the X that we can start to create that same thing because otherwise you talked about health of the industry. The Supreme helped make the industry healthy. Is that accurate?
Oh, I think so. I think, yeah, it was an outlet. Yes, it did. It helped make the industry healthy because it embraced all three. The horse sale part of it was really a natural outcome of, I suppose, if you remember, Jeff, in the early stages of the stallion subscription program, the featured stallions, a lot of people would bring their stallions to the Canadian Supreme and they would have a stallion showcase. as it grew and grew, it became totally untenable to try to feature or have a Stallion Avenue with all of those stallions there. But in the early days, it was that, and some people wouldn't bring their stallions; they would bring an offspring of the stallions, and that kind of morphed in. That's kind of where the sale venue started to spring up, because these offspring were, of course, for sale.
Yeah, and I remember, there was people that would bring their stallions every year, and they were so damn proud of them, and they would, they had their stallion sign, and then we had Stallion Avenue, and they were so damn proud. They get all dressed up and parade that thing down the middle of the arena. It was awesome, and how much pride each person took in their stallion and wanted to show them off. And yeah, it was super fun, really. I mean, thinking about that back, and obviously I think it just became unmanageable to try and get stallions from all across the country there. But yeah, I think it was probably good that it fizzled a bit, but it didn't fizzle the enthusiasm for the subscribed stallions.
No, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say, like to me, like the foundation of all the aspects that were so integral into the Canadian Supreme being this Canadian Supreme, I don't think any of those things have changed, because again, this is what people talk to me about. You need this, you need this. I think the only thing that's changed is how do you do those things, and we're working on that. But this, to me, like having this conversation with Jeff today is about like how to build a successful horse show or a horse program. Jeff, I want to catch up with what you kind of been up to in the time before, but as the Supreme kind of came to an end, and you continue to be heavily involved in CFR and other things outside of that we haven't had, or personally I haven't had a lot of experience with. But I feel like there's so many things that you've learned as far as a leader in the industry. What does that work look like for you?
Yeah, I think that's what it kind of culminated to us deciding to, slow down or not continue to do the Supreme. But our volunteer group had gotten, they put in, like, some of those people put in like 20, 30 years of volunteering, and nobody was getting any younger, and the show was very demanding, and it takes its toll on people. So we talked about it, the legacy of the show and keeping it going, but at the same time, everybody else has is getting pulled in tons and tons of different directions. And so for me, the CPRA, or the Canadian Professional Rodeo Association, was a big part of my life, obviously. And so, dealing with, running it. And obviously we were going through venue changes ourselves and trying to figure out what's the best place to put it. And obviously I had a ton of experience of dealing with Westerner Park. And, so we moved the CFR from Edmonton to Red Deer, and and then just in the last year we got moved back, which was I think that's having the CFR back in Edmonton is an amazing thing, and having it in Rogers Place is even more amazing. And it was where it was destined to be, probably. But it's as with everything, life gets busy, and so between that and work, and I coach hockey, and it's my 17th season of coaching hockey, and that takes a lot of energy. And so just trying to figure out which things you want to just put your energy into, and that's kind of where it's evolved to. So now I'm way less involved in the CPRA, and hired my replacement a couple years back, and he's done an amazing job with the association. And so.
Well,
that's a lot of changes, but I was just going to throw in the defense. because the Canadian Supreme was the gold standard and is still referred to as the gold standard in shows, I'm with Dave on this. I hope you know that, Jeff. I hope you recognize that still that memory and that value on the Canadian Supreme is still recognized in the industry. But I also, in defense of the Canadian Supreme's demise and stopping the calling a halt to the Canadian Supreme, people had to recognize it really was a stallion subscription-based program. And
Yep.
significant things changed in the breeding of the American quarter horse. And so many things changed with ship cooled semen and multiple registrations. It really presented to a show like the Canadian Supreme, those were difficult challenges indeed, and really reduced the number of stallions that were subscribed to the program. Therefore, it diluted the program. So in all fairness, there was a lot of factors at play in there. And I think that sometimes there's a little bit of a bad rap pushed across the table, like, why don't we have it anymore? But I think you touched on a lot of the significant.
Yeah. I can speak to that a
Go
little
ahead,
bit, Ron, because the reality is the investment, hours, money, just the carrying insurance, all of the things that come with putting on a horse event, that's not obvious to the person who hasn't put on that show before. And if one thing I can say for sure is I know like the importance of communicating people. Like I have a hard time going out and asking people, hey, we need that support. And a lot of it does need to come from that sponsors and from the various partners that we have out there. But I would just say that, hey, if you want these types of things like the Canadian Supreme to continue, then make sure that you support it if you love it. And I think, Jeff, if I'm not mistaken, because I recall a conversation, you remember this, but you offered me at one point in time, was that you can buy the Canadian Supreme and I'll only charge you $1. And when you said that, it really hit home for me, because I'm like, yeah, okay, I get it. Like the risk and the investment, unfortunately, it went away. And that's not on you guys. Like that's on the industry. The industry has to support something that they love. It is our job to communicate what support do we need. And I need to get better at that. But am I on the right track here, Jeff? Is that just the reality of sort of where it went down?
Yeah. And I think, it's an enormous investment. And, I think Ron touched on it earlier. Maybe you did, Betty put a lot of her man hours every year into that show. And so we always had, there's organizing meetings. There was, organizing meetings. Lots of things. So you're constantly, being invested in that. And so I think, yeah, it's a big commitment. And if you're not going to do it with all the, gusto and vigor that you probably shouldn't. And so, yeah. And, I think there's lots of people, it's kind of like rodeos too. Like you're always, it's just easy to put on a rodeo. Well, it's not. And, I tested that theory. We hosted our own rodeo in the new Calgary building, quite a few years back, as an organization, because the organization is, said, well, we can do these things. Well, it took a ton of people and a ton of man hours and some great sponsors to pull that off, just to break even. And those things cost real money, and you want to have good prize money, and you want to have all those things, but it takes a lot of work. So I can tell you from my own experience, it's a very, very, very like you have to be on it all the time. You can't just show up that week and expect it just to be great. And then I think too, you factor in, it's no different than any other. My dad used to call them cults. Everybody had a cult they belonged to. He just said my cult is all about horses. But he said, sometimes too, people, for you guys have been great about the accolades, but on the other side of that, there's some non-accolades you get, and why is this not this way, or why is this that way, and you can think of everything. You think you can think of everything, but you're not always gonna. And so instead of people being accepting of that, and they're spending a lot of money, and I get it, they want a big say in it. So sometimes that wears on people too, right? So I think all that takes its toll.
You touched on something that hits home for me, because you won't be surprised to know, as far as putting on a horse show, I get a lot of tips. And so when somebody says, you know what you should do, and I'm like, oh, so in your experience of running a horse show, how did that work for you? Oh, well, never run a horse show before. Oh, okay, thank you. And that's where, Jeff, I don't even know if are aware until now, or I'm telling you right now, but we have leaned on you and your family show as, you don't know, like I'm sitting beside you on the bench or in the dressing room or whatever, and I'm picking your brain. It's like, because I need these nuggets, because you don't want to we obviously make so many mistakes, and now Ron's probably going to laugh at me or whatever, because he saves me from a lot of mistakes, but you guys have directed us. So I thank you for this. I thank you for the opportunity to come back and reflect on what we hope that we can become. And I'm just going to segue into this, because as we're moving our big exhibition show this summer to the Nutrient Building at the Calgary Stampede Park, there is the Dave Robson room that's up above. I can't wait for the Rainers to come and experience that facility. And I hope that, in some way we can honor and continue to, have this conversation about the Canadian Supreme. It's been a guiding light for us. Love to have you come down there and join us during that time, because we're having a lot of fun. We have a lot of work to do. We're just getting started. This is going into year 4, but coming on today and giving up, already an hour of your time. I know that you've got a very successful business that you're working on, and you continue to inspire and support others with that knowledge that you've had. So, a big thank you to today. There's so many more questions that I, have come from today. So I look forward to breakfast, coffee, and all of that. But, Ron or Mark, I don't know, do you guys want to jump on here before we let Jeff go and get back to his day?
Well, I just wanted to ask him if he wanted to talk about either his capital business, or he's actually the second guest. He's wearing a 25th anniversary Edge School jacket there. He's actually the second guest from the Edge School. Say hi to Dr. Matt Brown, our good friend, if you see him.
Right.
If you wanted to talk about your coaching and the team, or anything else that we haven't asked you about that's going on in your world today that you'd like to share with us.
I had a good visit with Dr. Brown this morning, actually, right after our video session. So yeah, no, it's good to see him. I'm jealous. He's a great guy. Work is busy. We have kind of 2 lines of our business that in terms of Veda Capital, which Veda was, obviously, people know, it was named after Val and Dave. So that's an important part of who we are and our family. And then the second part of our business, which is, only a couple of years old, is a fractional CFO business. We ended up getting asked to do, strategy, financial look aheads, and help people with, setting up bank covenant discussions, forecasting, really a good group of people that we have now that we work with. And so it's been a tremendous amount of fun around helping young businesses, older businesses, established businesses that need to rejig. And so that's kind of the majority of our customer base. It's all the same principles that Dave ran within our own businesses, but now we've expanded that to helping other people, and so been having a ton of fun with that. And then as I think this is my 5th season of coaching hockey at the Edge School, and last 4 seasons coached the Edge boys AAA team, and had I was trying to think the other day how many WHL draft picks we had in those 4 years, but it was a ton. And last year, like we set an all-time record for the most amount of kids that got drafted into by one team. So we had 19 kids in our roster, and 15 of them went to the draft. So, and 2 were too young to get drafted. So, 15 out of 17 isn't too bad. I think even those 2 that weren't drafted have already been scooped up by WHL teams now. So, yeah, I think I had the likes of working with kids like Charlie Ellick and Jackson Smith, and probably most notably Landon DuPont in the last year, who's received exceptional status in the WHL and then doing amazing stuff this year and as an underager. And yeah, I think he'll be a fun name to watch come along, and got to coach with some really amazing people. And yeah, this year I'm coaching the U18 AAA female team with Annette Jensen, and I'm having a ton of fun working with them and helping them find their journey to hopefully post-secondary scholarship situations. So yeah, no, it's been lots of fun.
Fantastic. Awesome. And I do have to say, I really appreciated your story about when you were sitting in the booth with Ron at the Canadian Supreme, and your dad had to remind you guys to pay attention. And because a lot of people like to bug Ron and I, we end up spending, especially at the cutting shows, a lot of time together. And I don't want to ever apologize for having a good time up there in the booth with Ron. So I'm happy to carry on another great tradition that you started with Ron at the Supreme, that we can carry on in our exhibition work now. So.
Well, there's only one Walmart greeter that'll ever be as funny as Ron Anderson, and that's Ron Anderson. So
yes. Agreed, 100%.
Take us out here, Ron.
Thanks. I tell you what, I got one more thing to say to you, Jeff. It's just,
there we go.
I'm really pleased. Well,
Ron, you seem to be on a slight a bit of a delay. That's why we keep talking over you. I'm going to stop talking.
This conversation. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm just going to say that over the time and the conversation that we've had, what I'm seeing is something that really means a lot to me, and I'll pay you the highest compliment that I can pay you. I really, really thought your dad was a very special man. And I will say this, his attributes are still alive and well, and they're operating in Jeff. So Jeff, good on you, buddy. 17 years of coaching hockey. You're running that business. You've got your hand on it. You understand it. You're obviously successful in that part. I hope it's making you happy, because it should. It makes me happy to see you and hear from you. So,
well, my only regret is that we don't spend enough time together, Ron.
I know how to fix that for you, Jeff. We can make it a package deal. See, Jeff didn't say that because he's so busy involved in Jeff's so involved in coaching the,
you guys still there?
Girls there. Yeah, we're here, Ron. And so Jeff misses out on more than hockey, more than he should, but that's okay. So, well, hey, thank you again, Jeff, and Ron seems to be breaking up a little bit on us there, but this has been awesome. Here he is.
Good time.
This is great. This is an opportunity here for anyone who's ever, been made fun of by Ron, and you poke fun at Ron, but he just gets you back. But this, he can't. Like, here we go.
I feel like I got him right where I want him, and I don't know what to say.
Opportunities knocking here.
Ron wins again. Ron wins again. All right. Well, I think we're finished with this episode. As I said, I was looking forward to this. Jeff, let's continue this conversation, because there are so many lessons to be learned from us, and don't, I would thank you for letting us, take those lessons from yourself and from your family. And I look forward to continuing this conversation moving forward as we try to be successful for 40 years that you guys ran. So thank you.
Awesome. And good luck with your exhibition.
All right.
Thanks, you.
Okay, see you guys.
Bye now.
Cheers.